In the scorching desert of 1882 Arizona Territory, where the sun bleached bones white and vultures circled overhead like death's own sentries, a lone cowboy named Jake Morrison was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The Apache Wars had turned the frontier into a killing ground, where trust was scarcer than water and mercy was a luxury few could afford. But, on this particular day, when Jake found himself surrounded by a war party with their rifles trained on his chest, 3 young Apache girls would step forward with markings on their skin that would change the course of his life forever. Their painted symbols told a story that even the fiercest warriors couldn't ignore, a story of debt, honor, and a promise made in blood that would force Jake to make the most dangerous decision of his life. What happened next would be whispered around campfires for generations, a tale so extraordinary that some called it legend, others called it miracle, but those who lived it simply called it the day when courage wore war paint and spoke in a language older than the desert itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Jake Morrison guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass. His weathered hands gripped the reins loosely, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the cliff tops and rock formations for any sign of movement. The Apache had been particularly active in this region lately, and Jake knew better than most that traveling alone through their territory was like playing cards with death itself. Jake was a man shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life. At 32, his face already bore the deep lines of someone who had seen too much violence and made too many hard choices. His thick brown beard was streaked with premature gray, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in Tucson 3 years earlier. He wore a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and boots that had walked more miles than most men could count in a lifetime. The horse beneath him was a sturdy buckskin mare named Dusty, chosen more for endurance than speed. In this unforgiving landscape, the ability to keep moving when others faltered was often the difference between life and death. Jake's Winchester rifle rested across his saddle, within easy reach, while his Colt .45 sat heavy on his right hip. These weren't decorations, they were tools of survival, and Jake had used them both more times than he cared to remember. The silence of the desert was deceptive. To untrained ears, it might seem peaceful, even serene. But Jake had learned to read the subtle signs that others missed. The way certain birds suddenly stopped singing. The nervous shifting of small animals in the brush. The almost imperceptible change in the wind's direction. All of these things spoke to him in a language written in blood and hard experience. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake's instincts screamed danger. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what. The air seemed thicker somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his neck stand up. Dusty sensed it too, her ears flicking forward and back, her gait becoming more cautious. That's when Jake saw them. 7 Apache warriors emerged from concealed positions among the rocks as if materializing from the desert itself. They moved with the fluid grace of men born to this harsh landscape, their painted faces and traditional dress marking them as members of the fierce Chiricahua band. Each warrior carried weapons, some had rifles taken from fallen soldiers or settlers, others bore traditional bows with arrows that could punch through a man's chest at 50 yards. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but he forced himself to remain still. 7 against 1 were impossible odds, even for someone with his skills. His mind raced, calculating possibilities, looking for any advantage, any escape route. But the warriors had chosen their ambush spot well. The canyon walls rose steep and unforgiving on both sides, offering no way out except forward or back, and Jake could see more warriors blocking both directions. The leader of the war party stepped forward. He was a tall man, probably in his 40s, with intricate black and red war paint covering his face. Silver ornaments hung from his ears, and eagle feathers adorned his long black hair. When he spoke, his English was clear but heavily accented, each word chosen carefully. "White man travels alone through Apache land," the warrior said, his dark eyes never leaving Jake's face. "This shows either great courage or great foolishness. Which are you, cowboy?" Jake kept his hands visible and away from his weapons. In situations like this, the wrong move could mean death before he even realized he'd made it. "Neither, I suppose," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Just a man trying to get from one place to another without trouble." The Apache leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. All white men bring trouble to Apache land. Your soldiers hunt our families. Your miners poison our streams. Your ranchers steal our hunting grounds. And you say you bring no trouble? Jake had heard similar accusations before, and he knew there was truth in them. The territorial government's policy toward the Apache had been brutal and often indiscriminate. Innocent families had been slaughtered alongside warriors. Treaties had been broken almost as soon as they were signed. The cycle of violence seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger with each passing year. I'm not a soldier or a miner, Jake said carefully. I'm just a man looking for work. I've got no quarrel with the Apache people. All white men say this when they face Apache guns, another warrior interjected from Jake's left. This one was younger, maybe 25, with angry scars across his chest that looked like they came from a cavalry saber. They sing different song when they have advantage. The leader raised his hand slightly, and the younger warrior fell silent. You carry weapons of a fighting man, the leader observed, gesturing toward Jake's rifle and pistol. Winchester rifle, good condition. Colt pistol, well maintained. These are not tools of peaceful man. Jake nodded slowly. In this country, a man without weapons is a dead man. I carry them for protection, not to start fights. Protection from who? The leader's voice carried a hint of amusement. From Apache? Before Jake could answer, the sound of voices drifted up from deeper in the canyon. The warriors tensed immediately, weapons raising slightly. Jake strained to listen, trying to identify the source of the commotion. The voices were speaking in Apache, too fast and distant for him to understand, but he could hear the distress in them. The leader barked a quick command, and one of the warriors disappeared into the rocks, moving with remarkable stealth. Within minutes, he returned, speaking rapidly to the leader in Apache. Jake watched the exchange carefully, noting the way the leader's expression darkened with each word. When the warrior finished his report, the leader turned his attention back to Jake. But now there was something different in his manner, a urgency that hadn't been there before. There is trouble in our camp, the leader said. White soldiers have taken captives 3 young girls from our people. Jake felt his stomach tighten. The taking of captives was a common tactic on both sides of the Apache wars, but it was the children who suffered most. Apache children captured by the military were often sent to distant boarding schools, stripped of their culture and language. Sometimes they were never seen by their families again. I'm sorry to hear that, Jake said, and he meant it. But I don't see how that involves me. The leader studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Perhaps it does not, he said finally. But Apache justice is swift. Blood calls for blood. And you are here, in Apache land, carrying white man's weapons. The implication was clear. Jake was going to pay the price for whatever crimes had been committed by other white men. It was a form of justice that made perfect sense from the Apache perspective. Collective responsibility was a fundamental part of their worldview. But, from Jake's position, staring down the barrels of 7 rifles, it felt like anything but justice. The younger warrior with the scars spoke up again, his voice harsh with anger. Let us take his weapons and horses. Leave him to walk through desert. The sun will give him Apache justice. Jake had seen men die of thirst in the desert. It was not a quick death, nor a merciful one. The human body could only survive 3 days without water under ideal conditions. In the blazing Arizona sun, that time was cut drastically short. Even if someone found his body eventually, it would be little more than dried leather stretched over bones. But, before the leader could respond, another commotion arose from the direction of the Apache camp. This time, Jake could make out individual voices, young voices, speaking rapidly and urgently in Apache. The warriors around him looked toward the sound, and Jake saw something he hadn't expected to see in their faces: concern. The leader called out something in Apache, and a response came echoing back through the canyon. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the desperation in the young voice that answered. That's when Jake first saw them, 3 figures climbing desperately up the rocky slope toward their position. As they drew closer, Jake could see they were young Apache girls, probably between 12 and 16 years old. Their traditional dresses were torn and dirty, and they moved with the desperate urgency of people fleeing for their lives. But what struck Jake most was their faces. Even from a distance, he could see they bore markings, not the temporary paint worn for ceremonies or war, but something else. Something permanent. The girls reached the group of warriors, speaking rapidly and pointing back toward the main canyon. The leader listened intently, his face growing darker with each word. Jake noticed that all the warriors were looking at the girls with a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked almost like reverence. When the girls finished speaking, the leader turned to look at Jake with new eyes. There was still hostility there, but now it was mixed with something else, calculation. "These girls have escaped from the soldiers who took them," the leader said. "They bring news that changes things." Jake waited, sensing that whatever came next would determine whether he lived or died in this canyon. The leader gestured to the eldest of the three girls, who stepped forward with a dignity that belied her youth. "Show the white man your markings, little dear," he said in English. The girl pulled aside a torn section of her dress, revealing her left shoulder. There, clearly visible on her skin, was a tattoo, but not just any tattoo. Jake recognized it immediately, and his blood ran cold. It was a small but detailed image of a coiled rattlesnake, surrounded by stars in a specific pattern. Jake had seen that exact marking before, carved into a gravestone in the cemetery of a small mining town called Silver Creek. The marking belonged to a man named Samuel Morrison, Jake's older brother, who had died saving an Apache family from a group of drunken miners 5 years ago. The other two girls stepped forward as well, showing similar markings on their arms and shoulders. All bore symbols that Jake recognized from Samuel's belongings: a hawk in flight, a desert rose, and other images that his brother had carved into leather goods and wooden trinkets during his years working as a trader with various Apache bands. "Your brother," the leader said, watching Jake's face carefully, "was known to our people as a man of honor. He died protecting Apache children from white men who would have killed them for sport. Our medicine man gave these girls his markings as protection, so that all Apache would know they were under his spirit's guardianship." Jake stared at the girls, his mind reeling. Samuel had never told him about this, had never mentioned any special relationship with the Apache. But, then, Samuel had been a man who spoke more through actions than words. "I didn't know," Jake said quietly. "There is more," the leader continued. "Before he died, your brother made a promise to our people. He said that if Apache children were ever in danger, any member of his family would honor his debt to our people. He swore this on his blood and ours." Jake felt the weight of his brother's promise settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Samuel had always been the one who believed in doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. It was exactly the kind of promise he would make, and exactly the kind of promise he would expect his family to honor. "What happened to these girls?" Jake asked. "Where are the soldiers now?" The eldest girl, Little Deer, spoke in careful English. "Blue soldiers came to winter camp 3 days ago. They said they looked for raiders who attacked supply wagon. We told them no raiders in our camp, but they not believe. They took 12 of us, children and young women. Said we would go to school far away, learn white man's ways. We were kept in wagon with chains," the second girl added, her voice shaking with remembered fear. "But, last night, soldiers made camp near water. They drank firewater and became careless. We escaped when they slept." Jake could imagine the scene all too clearly. Military discipline often broke down when soldiers were far from their officers and had access to alcohol. It was during such moments that the worst atrocities were committed on both sides of the conflict. "The others?" Jake asked. "The other children who were taken?" Little Deer's expression grew pained. "Still with soldiers. They moved toward fort. 2 days' travel, maybe 3 if they stopped to rest." The leader stepped closer to Jake, his eyes intense. "The spirits have brought you here at this moment, brother of Samuel Morrison. This is not chance. This is destiny calling you to honor your family's promise." Jake understood what was being asked of him, and the magnitude of it was staggering. The Apache wanted him to help rescue the other captive children from a military patrol. It would mean going up against trained soldiers, probably outnumbered, certainly outgunned. And, if he was caught, it would mean a hanging if he was lucky. Military justice for someone who interfered with official operations could be far more creative in its cruelty. But, as he looked at the three girls standing before him, bearing his brother's symbols on their skin, Jake felt something shift inside him. These weren't abstract political problems or distant injustices. These were children who had been torn from their families, who faced a future of cultural death even if they survived physically. "How many soldiers?" he asked. The leader's eyes showed approval at the question. It meant Jake was considering the proposition seriously. Little Deer saw 8 soldiers and 1 officer, the leader replied. "But they have wagon, horses, supplies. They move slow, stop often." Jake did quick calculations in his head. 9 armed men against what? The Apache could contribute perhaps a dozen warriors, but attacking soldiers directly would bring massive retaliation against their entire band. The territorial government was already looking for excuses to remove the Apache from their traditional lands. A direct attack on military personnel would provide all the justification they needed. But there might be another way. "I need to think about this," Jake said. "And I need to know exactly what you're asking me to do." The leader nodded. "You will have time to think while we travel. But, know this, if you help us recover our children, your debt to the Apache people will be paid, and you will always have safe passage through our lands. If you refuse..." He left the threat unspoken, but Jake understood. Refusing would mean dishonoring his brother's memory and breaking a sacred promise. The Apache took such things very seriously. "We leave at sunset," the leader said. "You will come with us, and we will see what manner of man Samuel Morrison's brother truly is." As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously a prisoner and a potential ally. The Apache warriors remained watchful but no longer overtly threatening. The 3 girls stayed close to Little Deer, who seemed to serve as their unofficial leader despite her youth. Jake spent the time studying the terrain and thinking through possible scenarios. The more he considered the situation, the more he realized that a direct assault would be suicide for everyone involved. But there might be other options, ways to use cunning instead of force, deception instead of direct confrontation. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, the leader approached Jake one final time. "It is time to choose, brother of Samuel Morrison. Will you ride with us into the darkness, or will you die here in the light?" Jake looked at the 3 girls one more time, seeing the hope and fear warring in their young faces. He thought about his brother Samuel, who had always believed that a man's character was measured not by what he did when it was easy, but by what he did when everything was on the line. The decision, when it came, felt as inevitable as the sunset. "I'll ride with you," Jake said. "But we do this my way, or not at all." The leader smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. "Then, let us see what your way looks like, Samuel Morrison's brother. The night has much to teach us all." The moon hung like a silver dollar in the star-scattered sky as Jake Morrison rode through the desert night alongside 7 Apache warriors and 3 frightened girls. The temperature had dropped dramatically after sunset, transforming the scorching wasteland into a realm of cool shadows and whispered winds. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, grateful for the respite from the day's punishing heat. The leader of the Apache band had introduced himself as Standing Wolf, a name that suited his patient but predatory nature. As they rode, Standing Wolf shared details about the military patrol they were pursuing. The soldiers were led by Lieutenant Marcus Crawford, a young officer fresh from West Point who had been making a name for himself by aggressively pursuing Apache bands throughout the territory. "Crawford is ambitious," Standing Wolf explained as they navigated a rocky wash. "He wants promotion, recognition from his superiors. Taking Apache children to boarding schools makes him look successful in Washington eyes." Jake had encountered men like Crawford before, career soldiers who saw the Apache wars as opportunities for advancement rather than human tragedies. They often took unnecessary risks and made decisions based on how they would look in official reports rather than tactical wisdom. This could work in their favor, but it also made Crawford unpredictable. Little Deer rode close to Jake, her young face serious in the moonlight.
"Lieutenant Crawford has angry eyes," she said quietly.
"He speaks to Apache children like we are animals. The other soldiers, some show kindness when he's not looking.
But they fear him." This information was valuable. It suggested the patrol might not be as unified as it appeared.
Soldiers who were uncomfortable with their orders might be more likely to make mistakes, especially if given the right incentives.
As they tracked the military column, Jake's plan began to take shape.
A direct assault would be catastrophic for everyone involved, but there were other ways to accomplish their goal. The key was to create confusion and opportunity while minimizing the risk of casualties on both sides.
"Standing Wolf," Jake said during a brief rest, "I need to know about the terrain ahead. Where would soldiers make camp for the night?"
The Apache leader considered the question carefully.
"There is a place called Willow Springs, perhaps 2 hours ahead. Good water, shelter from wind, easy to defend. If they stop tonight, it will be there." Jake nodded. Willow Springs sounded perfect for what he had in mind. "How many of your men speak English well enough to pass for scouts or traders in the dark?" 3, perhaps 4 with good English." "But why?" "Because we're not going to attack them," Jake explained.
"We're going to confuse them, divide them, and give them reasons to make mistakes."
"But I'll need your word that no one acts without my signal."
"One shot fired too early, and those children die."
Standing Wolf studied Jake's face in the moonlight.
"You ask much trust for white man we met only hours ago."
"Your brother Samuel earned that trust," Little Deer said unexpectedly.
Both men turned to look at her, surprised by her interruption.
"The spirits brought his brother to us when we needed him most. This is not accident."
The conviction in her young voice seemed to settle something for Standing Wolf.
"Tell us your plan, Samuel Morrison's brother." Jake outlined his strategy as they rode.
It was risky and required precise timing, but it offered their best chance of success without triggering a massacre. The Apache listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions or pointing out potential problems. Despite their different cultures and the language barriers, Jake found himself impressed by their tactical knowledge and willingness to adapt. By the time they reached the hills overlooking Willow Springs, Jake's plan had been refined and everyone understood their roles.
The military camp lay spread out below them, exactly where Standing Wolf had predicted.
The soldiers had positioned their wagons in a defensive circle, with guards posted at regular intervals. In the center of the camp, Jake could make out the huddled forms of the captive Apache children. "Count 9 soldiers plus the lieutenant," whispered Red Hawk, one of Standing Wolf's warriors who had been scouting ahead.
2 guards walking perimeter. Others around fire or sleeping. Children kept in wagon at center.
Jake studied the layout through a pair of field glasses he'd borrowed from Standing Wolf. The camp showed typical military organization, efficient but predictable.
The guard rotation seemed regular, and the placement of supplies and equipment followed standard Army protocols. This predictability could work in their favor. "Guards change every 2 hours," Jake observed. "Next change should be around midnight. That's when we move." The waiting was the hardest part.
Jake found himself thinking about his brother Samuel, wondering what had driven him to make such a dangerous promise to the Apache people. Samuel had always been the idealistic one, the brother who believed that right and wrong were clearly defined lines that should never be crossed. Jake had learned to live in the gray areas between those lines, making pragmatic compromises that Samuel would have rejected. But tonight, in this desert canyon, those gray areas seemed less important than the frightened faces of children who had been torn from their families. As midnight approached, Jake made his final preparations. He had changed into darker clothing borrowed from the Apache, and his face was now painted with traditional patterns that would help him blend into the shadows. The transformation felt strange but oddly appropriate. "Remember," he told the assembled warriors one final time, "no one moves until you hear my signal."
3 I'll calls, then applause, then 2 more. Anything else means abort and retreat. Standing Wolf clasped Jake's shoulder in a gesture of respect. "May the spirits of your ancestors guide you, brother."
Jake began his descent toward the military camp, moving with the silent stealth techniques the Apache had taught him during their brief rest stops. The desert night was alive with small sounds, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through rock formations, the distant call of a coyote. Jake used these natural sounds to mask his approach. The first guard was a young soldier, probably no more than 19, who walked his patrol route with the mechanical precision of someone trying to stay awake. Jake watched him for 3 complete circuits, timing his movements and noting the spots where the guard paused to light his pipe or adjust his equipment. When the moment was right, Jake approached from the soldier's blind spot. "Easy there, son," Jake whispered, pressing the muzzle of his pistol against the soldier's back. "Not a word, or those children die because of the noise." The young soldier froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. "Who are you?" he whispered back. "Someone who's trying to prevent a massacre," Jake replied. "You got a family back east?" "Yes, sir. Wife and baby daughter in Ohio." "Then, you want to see them again. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk with me to that big rock over there, and you're going to sit down and count to 1,000 before you raise any alarm. During that time, you're going to think about whether those Apache children deserve to be torn away from their families the way you'd hate to be torn away from yours." The soldier was quiet for a long moment. "I never wanted this assignment," he said finally. "Lieutenant Crawford volunteered our unit. Said it would look good on his record. I figured as much." "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Tommy Henderson, sir." "Well, Private Henderson, you've got a choice to make. You can try to be a hero and get a lot of people killed, or you can give those children a chance to see their families again. What do you think your wife would want you to do?" Henderson's shoulders slumped in defeat. "She'd want me to do the right thing. She always does." "Then, come on. Let's find you a comfortable rock to sit on." Jake escorted Henderson to a concealed position away from the camp, then bound his hands and feet with rope. "Nothing personal, son. But I need time to work." The second guard was older and more experienced, but Jake had anticipated this. Instead of direct confrontation, he used misdirection. A well-placed stone created noise from the opposite direction, drawing the guard away from his post. By the time the soldier realized he'd been tricked, Jake was already inside the camp perimeter. The captive children were being held in the largest wagon, just as Red Hawk had reported. Jake could see them huddled together under a canvas tarp, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The oldest looked to be about 16, the youngest perhaps 8 years old. All showed signs of rough treatment during their journey. Jake approached the wagon carefully, staying in the shadows cast by the surrounding equipment. When he was close enough, he gave a low whistle, the call of a nighthawk that was common in this region. One of the older boys looked up, and Jake gestured for silence while pointing to himself and, then, toward the hills where the Apache waited. Understanding flashed in the boy's eyes. He whispered something to the other children, and Jake saw them prepare themselves for whatever was about to happen. The critical moment came when Lieutenant Crawford emerged from his tent to check on the guard rotation. Jake had been waiting for this, counting on the young officer's reputation for micromanagement. As Crawford walked toward the wagon, Jake stepped out of the shadows directly in front of him. "Good evening, Lieutenant," Jake said quietly. "We need to talk." Crawford's hand flew to his sidearm, but Jake was faster, his own pistol already drawn and aimed. "I wouldn't recommend that," Jake continued. "Your guards are taken care of, and you're surrounded by Apache warriors who would prefer to handle this quietly. But if you force their hand..." Crawford was a small man with pale eyes and a precisely trimmed mustache that did nothing to hide his youth. Despite the gun pointed at his chest, he maintained the rigid posture of military bearing. "Who are you?" Crawford demanded. "What do you want?" "I'm someone who thinks taking children from their families is wrong, regardless of military orders or territorial policy," Jake replied. "And what I want is simple: you're going to release these children and let them go home." Crawford's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You're insane. These are prisoners of war, captured during legitimate military operations. I have my orders." "Your orders are to take Apache raiders to justice," Jake said.
Are you telling me that 8-year-old girl in there is a dangerous raider? Apache children grow up to be Apache warriors, Crawford shot back. We're preventing future violence by civilizing them now.
Jake had heard this argument before, the twisted logic that justified cultural genocide in the name of peace. It was the same reasoning that had been used to justify the removal of Cherokee families from Georgia, the forced relocation of Plains tribes to reservations, and countless other injustices throughout the nation's expansion westward.
That's not your decision to make, Jake said firmly.
And it's not your government's decision either. These children have families who love them, communities that need them, cultures that give their lives meaning. You have no right to destroy that. Crawford's face flushed with anger.
I have every right granted by the authority of the United States Army and the territorial government.
You, on the other hand, are committing treason by interfering with military operations.
Maybe so, Jake admitted. But sometimes treason is just another word for doing what's right when your government's doing what's wrong.
The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the situation was resolved by an unexpected intervention. The oldest of the captive children, a boy of perhaps 15, had been quietly working to free himself from his bonds. As Jake and Crawford faced each other, the boy slipped from the wagon and approached them.
Lieutenant Crawford, the boy said in clear English, my name is Running Bear.
I speak for the others taken from our camp. Crawford spun around, surprised by the interruption. Get back in that wagon, boy, before you make this worse for yourself. But Running Bear stood his ground with the dignity of someone far older than his years. You say we are prisoners of war. But what war did we declare? What battles did we fight? We were gathering pine nuts when your soldiers came. The youngest among us has seen only 7 summers. What danger does she present to your great nation? The simple eloquence of the boy's words seemed to affect some of the soldiers who had been awakened by the commotion. Jake could see them gathering at the edges of the camp, their faces troubled. These were mostly young men themselves, far from their own families, following orders they didn't fully understand. Lieutenant Crawford sensed the mood shifting among his troops. This is not a debate, he said loudly. I have my orders, and they will be carried out. Anyone who interferes will be court-martialed. That's when Jake heard it, the signal he'd been waiting for. 3 owl calls from the hills above, applause, then 2 more. The Apache were in position and ready to act on his command.
Lieutenant, Jake said quietly, you need to understand something.
You're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by people who have nothing left to lose.
Your choice is simple, release these children peacefully, or watch your entire command get wiped out in a battle you can't win.
Crawford looked toward the hills, perhaps seeing the gleam of weapons in the moonlight for the first time.
You're bluffing.
A few Apache with old rifles can't stand against trained soldiers.
Jake shook his head sadly. You really don't understand this country, do you, Lieutenant?
Apache warriors have been fighting in these mountains since before your grandfather was born. They know every rock, every hiding place, every approach. Your soldiers are brave, but they're fighting on ground that belongs to their enemies. To emphasize his point, Jake cupped his hands and gave the call of a screech owl. Immediately, answering calls came from a dozen different positions around the camp, much closer than Crawford had expected. The lieutenant's confident expression began to crack as he realized how thoroughly his position had been compromised. This is impossible, Crawford whispered. We posted guards, we chose a defensible position. You chose a position that looks defensible to someone trained in European-style warfare, Jake corrected. But Apache don't fight like European armies. They use the land itself as a weapon. One of Crawford's sergeants approached cautiously. Sir, he said quietly, maybe we should consider the situation. If we're really surrounded.
We don't negotiate with hostiles, Sergeant, Crawford snapped.
But there was uncertainty in his voice now.
Running Bear spoke up again.
Lieutenant Crawford, I have learned your language, studied your ways at the mission school. I know your laws speak of justice, of protecting the innocent.
Where is justice in taking children from their mothers? Where is protection in forcing us to forget our ancestors, our sacred places, our very names? The young Apache's words hung in the desert air like an accusation. Jake could see the effect they were having on the enlisted men, many of whom were beginning to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had signed up for when they joined the army. They had expected to fight warriors, not to kidnap children. Crawford seemed to sense the erosion of his authority. "These are government policies," he said defensively. "I don't make the rules, I just follow orders." "Every tyrant in history has hidden behind that excuse," Jake replied. "But orders don't erase moral responsibility. You still have to look at yourself in the mirror every morning and live with the choices you make." The moment of decision came when one of the younger soldiers, a boy who couldn't have been much older than Running Bear, stepped forward and laid his rifle on the ground. "Sir," the soldier said, his voice shaking, "I can't do this. These children haven't hurt anyone. I joined the army to protect people, not to destroy families." Crawford's face turned red with fury. "Pick up that weapon, Private Morrison, or I'll have you shot for mutiny." Jake's blood ran cold as he heard the name. "Morrison," he said. "What's your first name, soldier?" The young private looked confused. "David, sir. David Morrison." Jake felt the world tilt around him. "You wouldn't happen to have had an uncle named Samuel Morrison, would you? A man who did some trading with Apache tribes about 5 years back?" David's eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Uncle Samuel. But how did you know?" "Because I'm your Uncle Jake," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. Samuel's younger brother. The recognition that flashed between them seemed to crystallize something in the moment. Here, in this remote desert canyon, family had found family in the most unlikely of circumstances. And, suddenly, the choice between duty and conscience became much clearer. David Morrison looked from his uncle to the Apache children, then back to Lieutenant Crawford. "Sir," he said firmly, "I respectfully refuse to continue this mission. These children deserve to go home to their families." Crawford's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Jake was ready. "I wouldn't, Lieutenant. You've lost the moral authority to lead these men, and you're about to lose the practical authority as well." As if to prove his point, 2 more soldiers laid down their weapons and stepped away from the wagon. The psychological momentum was shifting rapidly, and Crawford seemed to realize it. "This is mutiny," Crawford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is conscience," Jake replied. "Something you might want to try sometime." Standing Wolf chose that moment to make his presence known, emerging from the shadows with 3 of his warriors. They moved with such silent grace that they seemed to materialize from the desert itself. The remaining loyal soldiers raised their weapons, but found themselves facing Apache rifle barrels from multiple directions. "Lieutenant Crawford," Standing Wolf said in his careful English, "you have 2 choices. Release the children and depart in peace, or face the consequences of your actions. Choose quickly, before my young warriors decide they have waited long enough for justice." Crawford looked around the camp, taking in the full scope of his situation. Half his men had laid down their weapons, he was surrounded by Apache warriors, and his defensive position had been completely compromised. The textbook military solutions he had learned at West Point offered no guidance for this kind of moral complexity. "If I release them," Crawford said finally, "my career is finished. I'll be court-martialed, dismissed from service, disgraced. If you don't release them," Jake said quietly, "your life is finished. Along with the lives of everyone here who's still following your orders." The silence stretched taut between them, filled only by the whisper of desert wind and the distant call of a night bird. Finally, Crawford's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Sergeant Williams," he called to his remaining loyal non-commissioned officer. "Release the prisoners. All of them." As the Apache children emerged from the wagon, Jake felt a profound sense of completion, as if a debt that had been carried for years was finally being paid. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. The real test would come with dawn, when they had to figure out how to get everyone safely away from this place before reinforcements arrived. Running Bear approached Jake as the other children gathered around Standing Wolf. "Thank you," the boy said simply. "You have honored your brother's promise." Jake nodded, emotion thick in his throat. He would have done the same thing, probably better. Perhaps, Running Bear smiled. But, the spirits sent you, not him. And, that makes all the difference.
As the first hints of false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jake knew their real challenges were just beginning. They had won this battle, but the war between two cultures, two ways of life, would continue. For tonight, though, it was enough that 9 Apache children would sleep in their own beds instead of in the wagon of strangers who would have stolen their very souls. The desert had seen many things in its ancient history, but perhaps few as strange as this: the sight of a white cowboy, a defeated army lieutenant, a band of Apache warriors, and a group of freed children all standing together under the vast canopy of stars, united by the simple recognition that some things matter more than orders, more than politics, more than the endless cycle of violence that had defined the frontier for so long. It was a moment of peace in a land that had known too little peace. And, for Jake Morrison, it was the moment when he finally understood what his brother Samuel had been trying to tell him all along: that a man's worth was measured not by what he could take from the world, but by what he was willing to give up to protect what was right. The morning sun painted the desert sky in shades of amber and rose as Jake Morrison watched the rescued Apache children disappear into the maze of canyons that would lead them safely home. Standing Wolf had taken most of his warriors with them, leaving only Red Hawk and 2 others to help Jake deal with the aftermath of their midnight liberation. Lieutenant Crawford sat on a rock nearby, his face pale with the realization that his military career was almost certainly over. Jake's nephew David stood beside the remnants of the military patrol, his young face troubled but resolute. 3 other soldiers had chosen to stay with him rather than follow Crawford's remaining loyalists back to the fort. The moral crisis of the previous night had split the unit irreparably, and now Jake found himself responsible for the consequences. "Uncle Jake," David said quietly, "what happens now?" "The army won't just let this go. They'll send out search parties, maybe a whole company." Jake had been thinking about the same problem. Word would reach Fort Buchanan within a day or two, and the military response would be swift and brutal. The Territorial Command would see this incident as a direct challenge to their authority, and they would respond with overwhelming force. Every Apache band in the region would suffer for what they had done last night. "We need to get you boys somewhere safe," Jake said. "And we need to make sure the Apache don't pay the price for our actions." Lieutenant Crawford looked up from his brooding. "It's too late for that," he said bitterly. "Colonel Harrison will order sweeps through every canyon, every waterhole. He'll use this as justification to clear the Apache from the entire territory." Red Hawk, who had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, spoke up. "Standing Wolf knows this. He takes children to Sacred Canyon, place soldiers cannot find. But my people cannot hide forever. Winter comes soon, and we need hunting grounds, water sources." Jake understood the dilemma. The Apache could disappear into the wilderness for weeks or months, but they couldn't survive indefinitely without access to their traditional resources. Meanwhile, the military would use their disappearance as evidence of hostile intent, justifying even harsher measures. There was only one solution that Jake could see, and it was the most dangerous path possible. "I'm going to Fort Buchanan," he announced. "I'm going to tell Colonel Harrison exactly what happened, and I'm going to take responsibility for the whole thing." The reaction was immediate and unanimous. "You'll be court-martialed and shot," Crawford said. "The colonel will never believe a civilian's word over his officers," David protested. "This brings danger to your spirit," Red Hawk added in his careful English. "Apache way is to disappear, let anger cool with time." Jake had considered all these objections during the long sleepless hours before dawn. Any one of them might prove fatal to his plan. But he had also realized something else during those hours of reflection: running and hiding would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. The territorial government was already committed to a policy of Apache removal. Last night's events would simply accelerate a process that was already in motion. "Maybe so," Jake acknowledged. "But if I don't try to control the narrative, Crawford here will report back that his patrol was attacked by hostile Apache warriors. The colonel will have justification for a full-scale military campaign." Crawford's face flushed. "I would report the truth." "Would you?" Jake challenged.
Would you tell Harrison that half your men mutinied because they refused to kidnap children? Would you admit that you lost 9 prisoners to a single civilian and a handful of Apache? Or would you find a way to make this story reflect better on your leadership? The silence that followed was answer enough. Red Hawk studied Jake with new respect. You would sacrifice yourself to protect my people? I'm hoping it won't come to that, Jake admitted. But Samuel made a promise, and I intend to honor it. Besides, there might be a way to turn this situation to everyone's advantage. Over the next hour, as they prepared to separate and head in different directions, Jake outlined his strategy. It was a desperate gamble that relied on several assumptions about Colonel Harrison's character and priorities. But it was the only plan that offered hope for a peaceful resolution. David and the other soldiers who had sided with him would head north toward the mining town of Prescott, where they could lose themselves among the civilian population until the immediate crisis passed. Eventually, they could work their way back east and start new lives far from the territorial conflicts. Red Hawk would return to Standing Wolf with a message: the Apache should stay hidden for exactly 1 week, then send an emissary to Fort Buchanan under a white flag. The timing would be crucial to Jake's plan. Crawford and his remaining loyal soldiers would continue to the fort, but they would wait 24 hours before reporting the incident. This would give Jake time to reach Harrison first and present his version of events. Why would you do this for me? Crawford asked as they prepared to part ways. After everything that's happened? Jake considered the question. The young lieutenant had been following orders, just as he claimed. The real responsibility lay with the policies and prejudices that had created those orders in the first place. Because we're all trapped by this system, Jake said finally. You, me, the Apache, even Colonel Harrison. The only way out is to find a solution that lets everyone save face while doing the right thing. Crawford nodded slowly. I hope you know what you're doing, Morrison. For all our sakes. As the different groups scattered across the desert landscape, Jake found himself alone for the first time since this adventure began. He had perhaps 18 hours to reach Fort Buchanan ahead of Crawford's patrol, and the journey would take him through some of the most dangerous country in the territory. But, as he rode through the morning heat, Jake's mind was focused not on the physical dangers ahead, but on the challenge of convincing Colonel Harrison to see beyond military protocol to the larger humanitarian issues at stake. Fort Buchanan sat in a wide valley surrounded by low hills, its adobe walls and wooden buildings a stark intrusion on the natural landscape. Jake had been here before, during his brief stint as a civilian scout for the Army, and he remembered Harrison as a career officer who valued results over methods. If Jake could frame his proposal in terms that appealed to the colonel's practical nature, he might have a chance. Jake arrived at the fort just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. The guard at the gate recognized him and allowed him to enter without the usual delays. Within minutes, he was standing in Colonel Harrison's office, facing a man whose gray hair and weathered face reflected decades of frontier military service. Jake Morrison, Harrison said, rising from behind his desk. I haven't seen you since the Apache Springs incident last year. What brings you to my office? Jake had rehearsed this moment during his ride, but, standing before the colonel, he realized that all his careful preparations couldn't fully capture the complexity of the situation. He decided to rely on simple truth. Colonel, I need to report an incident involving Lieutenant Crawford's patrol and a group of Apache civilians. I was directly involved, and I wanted you to hear the facts from me before you receive the official report. Harrison's expression grew serious. Go on. Jake told the story from beginning to end, leaving out nothing significant. He described the circumstances of his capture by Standing Wolf's band, the discovery of the Apache girls bearing his brother's markings, the promise Samuel had made, and the events at Willow Springs. He explained the moral crisis that had split Crawford's patrol and the reasons behind the soldiers' decision to lay down their weapons. Throughout the recitation, Colonel Harrison's face remained carefully neutral, but Jake could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. This was a man who had spent his career dealing with the complexities of frontier warfare, and he understood the political implications of what Jake was describing. When Jake finished, Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke.
Mr. Morrison, you're confessing to interfering with a military operation, inciting soldiers to mutiny, and aiding in the escape of military prisoners. Any one of these charges could result in a lengthy prison sentence or worse.
Yes, sir, I understand that.
You also put Lieutenant Crawford in an impossible position. Whatever his personal feelings about his orders, he had a duty to carry them out.
Jake nodded. I know that too, Colonel. But sometimes duty to humanity has to take precedence over duty to policy.
Harrison walked to the window and looked out at the parade ground where soldiers were conducting evening drills. You know, Morrison, I've been fighting Apache for 15 years. I've seen good men killed by Apache warriors, and I've seen Apache families destroyed by army policies. This conflict has brutalized everyone involved. He turned back to face Jake.
But I've also learned something in those 15 years.
Military solutions only work when both sides are playing by the same rules.
The Apache don't fight like European armies, they don't think like European diplomats, and they don't respond to European-style pressure tactics.
Jake remained silent, sensing that Harrison was working through the implications of the situation. The truth is, Harrison continued, Washington has been pressuring me to show more aggressive results in Apache pacification.
Taking children to boarding schools looks like progress in the reports that get sent back east.
But I've always had my doubts about the effectiveness of such methods. This was more than Jake had dared hope for.
What would you consider effective, Colonel? Harrison resumed his seat behind the desk.
A negotiated settlement that allows the Apache to maintain their way of life within boundaries that don't conflict with territorial development. But that requires trust on both sides, and trust is exactly what we've been systematically destroying with policies like the one Crawford was implementing.
Jake saw his opening. What if there was a way to rebuild that trust? What if last night's incident could become the foundation for a different kind of relationship? Harrison raised an eyebrow. I'm listening.
Jake pulled out a chair and sat down, feeling for the first time that he might actually succeed in this desperate gamble.
The Apache who took those children are led by a man named Standing Wolf.
He's respected by several bands in this region, and he has the authority to negotiate on their behalf.
What happened last night proved that white men and Apache can work together when they have common cause. Common cause being the welfare of children. Exactly.
And that gives us a starting point for broader discussions. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful.
What exactly are you proposing, Morrison? A meeting. Standing Wolf, you, and a few trusted representatives from both sides.
Use last night's incident as proof that cooperation is possible, and build from there toward a formal agreement.
And what would be the terms of such an agreement? Jake had thought about this extensively during his ride.
The Apache get guaranteed access to traditional hunting and gathering areas during certain seasons. In exchange, they provide early warning about hostile bands from other territories, and they agree to assist in recovering stolen livestock or property. Both sides establish clear boundaries and communication protocols. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, considering the proposal. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured.
Such an arrangement would require approval from territorial headquarters, and ultimately from Washington.
The political climate right now favors more aggressive policies toward all Indian tribes.
But, if it worked, Jake pressed, if it actually reduced violence and created stability, wouldn't that be the kind of result that politicians could support? Possibly.
But it would also require me to overlook last night's incident, and to justify Crawford's failure to complete his mission.
Jake had anticipated this concern. What if Crawford's mission could be redefined? Instead of capturing children for boarding schools, what if his patrol had been gathering intelligence on Apache intentions? Last night's events could be presented as the successful establishment of contact with a previously hostile band.
Harrison smiled for the first time since the conversation began.
You're suggesting we turn a military failure into a diplomatic success?
I'm suggesting we focus on results rather than methods. 9 Apache children went home to their families, several bands now have a reason to trust Army promises, and you have the opportunity to pioneer a new approach to frontier relations.
The colonel stood and walked to a large map hanging on his office wall.
It showed the entire territorial region, with various military outposts, Apache reservations, and areas of recent conflict marked in different colors. The problem with your proposal, Morrison, is that it requires me to trust the word of Apache leaders I've never met, based on the recommendation of a civilian who just confessed to interfering with military operations.
Jake felt his heart sink. Had he misread Harrison's character so completely?
But, then, the colonel continued. However, it also offers the possibility of achieving something that 15 years of conventional military operations have failed to accomplish: actual peace in this region. Harrison traced his finger along several mountain ranges on the map.
These areas here, and here, are traditional Apache hunting grounds that are currently off limits to white settlement anyway because of the terrain.
If we could formalize Apache access to these areas in exchange for cooperation in other matters.
It could work, Jake said, hope rising in his chest.
It might work, Harrison corrected. But, it would require perfect timing, careful presentation to my superiors, and absolute trust between parties who have been killing each other for decades.
Jake stood up as well, moving to join the colonel at the map. Standing Wolf is expecting to send an emissary to the fort in 1 week.
That gives us time to prepare the groundwork, to present this to your superiors as a planned diplomatic initiative rather than a reaction to a crisis. Harrison pointed to a location on the map about 30 miles northwest of the fort. There's an old trading post here at Copper Creek. Neutral ground, good water, defensible but not threatening.
If this meeting is going to happen, it should be there. When? Jake asked. 10 days from now.
That gives me time to send the right kind of reports to territorial headquarters, and it gives your Apache friends time to organize their delegation properly. Jake felt a surge of excitement, but he forced himself to remain focused on practical details.
What about Crawford and his men?
They'll be arriving tomorrow with their version of events.
Harrison's smile turned grim. Lieutenant Crawford will find that his orders have been modified retroactively.
Instead of prisoner transport, he was conducting reconnaissance on Apache movements and establishing preliminary contact with potential negotiating partners. His report will reflect the success of this mission.
And the soldiers who laid down their weapons?
Will be commended for their restraint in a delicate diplomatic situation.
Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. Colonel, why are you willing to take such risks for this plan?
Harrison returned to his desk and picked up a daguerreotype photograph that sat next to his inkwell. The image showed a much younger Harrison in uniform, standing next to a woman holding a small child.
My wife and daughter were killed in an Apache raid 8 years ago, he said quietly. I've spent every day since then, trying to prevent other families from suffering the same loss. Military force hasn't accomplished that goal. Maybe it's time to try something different. The room fell silent as both men contemplated the magnitude of what they were attempting.
They were proposing to overturn decades of established policy, to risk their careers and reputations on the hope that natural human decency could overcome institutional prejudice and political expediency.
There are no guarantees, Harrison said finally.
This could end with both of us facing court-martial, the Apache facing renewed military persecution, and the region descending into worse violence than we've seen before.
Jake nodded.
But, if it works?
If it works, we might actually achieve something worth the risks we're taking. Outside, the evening parade was ending as soldiers marched back to their barracks.
The sound of their boots on the hard-packed earth carried through the office window, a reminder of the military machinery that would either support their efforts or crush them if the plan failed.
I'll need you to carry messages back to Standing Wolf, Harrison said.
The terms I'm prepared to discuss, the location and timing of the meeting, and the assurances I can offer regarding safe conduct.
I can do that. And, Morrison. Harrison's voice carried a warning.
If this goes wrong, if the Apache use this as an opportunity to gather intelligence for attacks, or if any of my soldiers are harmed during these negotiations.
I understand, Colonel. I'm betting my life on Standing Wolf's honor, just as you're betting your career on mine. Harrison extended his hand, and Jake shook it firmly. 10 days, then. Copper Creek. Let's see if we can write a different ending to this story. As Jake prepared to leave Fort Buchanan for his return journey to Apache country, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken in the past 48 hours. He had begun this adventure as a reluctant participant in someone else's crisis. Now he found himself carrying the hopes of two cultures that had been locked in mortal conflict for decades. The desert stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as Jake mounted his horse and rode out through the fort's main gate. Behind him lay the certainty of military protocol and established authority. Ahead lay the unknown territory where Apache warriors waited to hear whether his desperate gamble had succeeded. In 10 days, at a trading post called Copper Creek, the fate of the entire region would be decided by a handful of men willing to risk everything on the possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred, that negotiation could replace violence, and that the bonds of common humanity could bridge the vast cultural divide that had claimed so many lives on both sides. Jake Morrison, the reluctant cowboy who had stumbled into this crisis through family obligation and moral conviction, was about to discover whether the courage that had carried him this far would be enough to see it through to the end. The desert night closed around him like a vast embrace, holding secrets and possibilities that only the morning would reveal. The abandoned trading post at Copper Creek sat like a weathered monument to the region's more peaceful past. Built 15 years earlier by an optimistic merchant who had believed that commerce could bridge the gap between cultures, it had been abandoned when increasing violence made such neutral spaces untenable. Now, on a crisp October morning in 1882, it was about to serve its original purpose once again. Jake Morrison arrived at dawn, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies for what he hoped would be a historic gathering. The 10 days since his meeting with Colonel Harrison had passed in a whirlwind of activity. He had ridden back into Apache country to deliver the colonel's message to Standing Wolf, then spent days helping to arrange the complex logistics of bringing together two groups that had been trying to kill each other for decades. The trading post itself consisted of a main building with thick adobe walls, a smaller structure that had once served as a stable, and a well that still provided clear water. The location had been chosen carefully. It sat in a wide valley with good sightlines in all directions, making ambush difficult, but it was also defensible if things went wrong. As Jake unloaded his supplies, he reflected on the delicate negotiations that had brought them to this point. Standing Wolf had been cautiously optimistic about Colonel Harrison's proposal, but other Apache leaders had been deeply skeptical. The memory of broken treaties and violated truces ran deep in Apache oral tradition. It had taken all of Standing Wolf's influence, combined with the testimony of the rescued children about Jake's actions at Willow Springs, to convince the various band leaders to give negotiation a chance. The Army's preparation had been equally complex. Colonel Harrison had needed to walk a fine line between his superiors' expectations and the realities of the situation he was trying to create. His reports to territorial headquarters had emphasized the intelligence value of establishing contact with Apache leaders, while carefully avoiding details that might alarm officials who preferred more aggressive policies. Jake was checking his pocket watch when the first riders appeared on the horizon. Colonel Harrison approached from the southeast with a small escort, only 6 soldiers, chosen for their experience and steady temperament rather than their fighting ability. Harrison himself rode at the front, his bearing formal but not hostile. "Morrison," Harrison called out as he dismounted. "Any sign of our Apache friends?" "Not yet, Colonel, but they'll be here." Standing Wolf gave his word. Harrison nodded, but Jake could see the tension in his posture. The colonel was taking an enormous risk by meeting with Apache leaders without prior authorization from his superiors. If the negotiations failed, or worse, if the meeting turned violent, his career would be finished. The soldiers began setting up a camp near the main building, following Harrison's strict instructions to maintain a defensive posture without appearing threatening. Their rifles remained readily accessible but not obviously displayed. Camp equipment was arranged to provide cover if needed, but also to create an atmosphere of temporary settlement rather than military occupation. An hour later, Standing Wolf appeared. The Apache leader emerged from a rocky outcropping to the north as silently as morning mist. One moment the landscape appeared empty, the next moment he was there, mounted on a paint horse and regarding the army camp with careful attention. He was alone, which Jake knew was a deliberate statement of either confidence or courage. Standing Wolf rode slowly toward the trading post, his movements deliberate and unthreatening.
He wore traditional Apache clothing, a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, leather leggings, and moccasins that reached nearly to his knees. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status as a war leader, and the paint on his face followed patterns that Jake had learned signified peaceful intentions. Colonel Harrison stepped forward to meet him, and Jake found himself witnessing a moment that few white men had ever seen: a formal meeting between equals who represented two very different ways of understanding the world. Colonel Harrison, Standing Wolf, said in careful English, dismounting from his horse.
"I am Standing Wolf of the Chiricahua people.
You sent word through Jake Morrison that you wish to speak of peace between our peoples." Harrison removed his hat, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed.
"I did, Standing Wolf.
I believe we have much to discuss that could benefit both our peoples." The formal courtesies continued for several minutes, each man taking the measure of the other. Jake could see that both leaders were veteran negotiators who understood the importance of first impressions. Standing Wolf's English was better than Jake had expected, suggesting more contact with white culture than was typical for Apache war leaders.
Harrison's manner showed genuine respect rather than the condescension that often characterized military officers' dealings with Indian leaders. As the morning progressed, other participants began to arrive.
Red Hawk appeared with two other Apache warriors, followed shortly by an elderly woman whom Standing Wolf introduced as Singing Bird, a respected medicine woman whose presence would lend spiritual authority to any agreements reached. From the Army side, Harrison had brought Captain Robert Stevens, his most experienced Indian fighter and a man known for his fairness in dealing with Apache prisoners. Lieutenant Crawford arrived last, looking nervous but determined to make amends for the incident that had started this entire process. The formal negotiations began in the main room of the trading post, with participants seated in a rough circle on blankets spread across the floor. Jake found himself in the unusual position of serving as an informal translator, not just of language but of cultural concepts that didn't always transfer easily between Apache and American worldviews. The first hour was devoted to establishing ground rules and areas of mutual concern. Both sides acknowledged the cycle of violence that had characterized their relationship, and both expressed cautious hope that a different approach might be possible. But, beneath the diplomatic language, Jake could sense the deep suspicions and historical grievances that would make any agreement extremely difficult to achieve.
Standing Wolf spoke first about Apache concerns.
"My people have lived in these mountains since the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers. These are not empty lands that white men have found. They are our home, filled with sacred places, hunting grounds that have fed our children, water sources that give life to all creatures." He gestured toward the mountains visible through the trading post's windows. "Your soldiers say we must move to reservation lands that cannot support our way of life. Your government officials promise food and supplies that never come, or come spoiled and insufficient. Your miners and ranchers take our traditional resources and leave poison in the streams."
Colonel Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify specific points.
When Standing Wolf finished, the colonel responded with his own assessment of the military situation. "The territorial government faces pressure from Washington to open these lands for settlement and resource development," Harrison said. "Every Apache raid, every attack on settlers or soldiers, is used as justification for more aggressive policies.
My superiors want results that they can report as progress toward pacification."
He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But, I've learned that military force alone cannot solve this conflict. We can destroy Apache bands, but we cannot destroy the Apache spirit. And, destroying that spirit would be a loss for everyone involved."
This acknowledgement seemed to surprise the Apache delegation.
Singing Bird spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "The white soldier speaks truth," she said in Apache, which Red Hawk translated.
"But, truth-speaking is easy when enemies are far away.
When soldiers come to our camps with guns, truth becomes harder to remember." The discussion continued through the morning, touching on specific incidents and grievances from both sides. Jake was struck by how differently each culture interpreted the same events. What the Army saw as necessary security measures, the Apache experienced as unprovoked aggression. What the Apache viewed as legitimate defense of their homeland, the military classified as hostile resistance to lawful authority. But, gradually, areas of potential agreement began to emerge. Both sides wanted an end to the cycle of retribution that had claimed so many lives. Both recognized that the current situation was unsustainable. And, both seemed willing to consider compromises that had been unthinkable just weeks before. The breakthrough came when Little Deer, one of the girls Jake had helped rescue, arrived at the trading post accompanied by her father, a war leader named Gray Fox. Her presence served as a powerful reminder of what had brought them all together, the simple recognition that children deserved protection from the consequences of adult conflicts. Little Deer addressed the gathering in both Apache and English, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "I have seen the kindness in white men's hearts," she said, looking directly at Jake and, then, at the soldiers who had laid down their weapons that night at Willow Springs. "And, I have seen the cruelty that fear creates in all people. The man who helped save me and my sisters acted with courage because he chose to see us as children, not as enemies." She turned to Colonel Harrison. "If your soldiers could learn to see Apache children as children, and Apache mothers as mothers, would there be need for war between us?" The simplicity of the question cut through hours of complex political discussion. Harrison was quiet for a long moment before responding. "No," he said finally. "There would be no need for war." "Then, let us speak of how to teach the seeing," Standing Wolf said. The afternoon was devoted to hammering out specific details of a potential agreement. The terms that emerged were more comprehensive than Jake had dared hope for when he first proposed this meeting. The Apache bands represented by Standing Wolf would be granted formal recognition of their traditional hunting and gathering rights in specified mountain areas that were unsuitable for white settlement. In exchange, they would provide early warning of hostile Apache groups from other territories, assist in recovering stolen livestock, and establish formal protocols for resolving disputes without violence. The Army would establish a system of identification papers for Apache families, ensuring that peaceful bands would not be mistaken for hostiles during military operations. Regular meetings would be held between Apache leaders and military representatives to address problems before they escalated into violence. Most importantly, the policy of taking Apache children to distant boarding schools would be suspended in favor of local education programs that would teach English and practical skills while allowing children to remain with their families and maintain their cultural connections. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, both sides had reached the framework of an agreement that addressed most of their major concerns. But Jake knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when they tried to implement these principles in the face of opposition from extremists on both sides. Colonel Harrison stood to address the gathering one final time. "What we have accomplished here today is remarkable," he said. "But it is only the beginning. There will be those in my command who see any agreement with Apache as weakness. There will be those among your people who see any cooperation with the Army as betrayal. We must be prepared to defend this peace against those who profit from war." Standing Wolf nodded gravely. "The path we choose today is narrow and dangerous. But it leads to a future where our children may know peace instead of fear." As the formal meeting concluded, Jake found himself standing outside the trading post, watching the sun set over the desert landscape. The Apache delegation was preparing to depart, while the Army group would remain overnight before returning to Fort Buchanan. Red Hawk approached Jake as he stood in contemplation. "You have done a great thing, Jake Morrison," the warrior said. "Your brother's spirit guided us to this moment." "I hope so," Jake replied. "But the hardest part is still ahead. Making this agreement work will require more courage than it took to arrange it." Red Hawk smiled. "Courage you have already shown. Trust you have earned. The rest will follow if the spirits favor our cause." As the Apache riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, Jake reflected on the extraordinary events that had brought him to this point. 3 weeks ago, he had been a simple cowboy looking for work. Now he found himself at the center of a diplomatic revolution that could change the course of history in the American Southwest. Colonel Harrison joined him outside the trading post, both men watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Think it will work, Morrison?" the colonel asked. Jake considered the question carefully. "I think we've given it the best chance possible. The rest depends on whether people on both sides are willing to choose hope over fear."
Harrison nodded. That's always been the choice, hasn't it? In every war, every conflict, every moment when people have to decide between understanding and hatred. I suppose it has, Jake agreed. But, maybe for the first time in this country, we've created a space where the choice can actually be made. The night was peaceful around Copper Creek, filled with the sounds of desert life returning to normal after the unusual activity of the day. In the trading post, Lieutenant Crawford was writing his official report of the meeting, documenting what might prove to be the most important negotiations in the history of Apache-American relations. But, for Jake Morrison, the real significance of the day lay not in the political agreements or military protocols, but in the moment when Little Deer had spoken of seeing enemies as human beings. That was the foundation upon which all lasting peace had to be built, the simple recognition that the people on the other side of any conflict were people first, enemies second, and that understanding could triumph over fear if given the chance. As he prepared for sleep, Jake thought about his brother Samuel and the promise that had started this entire adventure. Samuel had believed that individual actions could make a difference, that one person's choice to do the right thing could ripple outward to affect entire communities. Looking back on the events of the past 3 weeks, Jake was beginning to understand that his brother had been right. The desert night settled around Copper Creek like a benediction, holding the promise of a different future for all who were brave enough to reach for it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile peace they had constructed. But tonight, for the first time in decades, Apache children and white settlers would sleep under the same stars without fear of what the other might do come morning. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. And, sometimes, Jake reflected as sleep finally claimed him, small beginnings were all that history needed to change direction entirely. 6 months had passed since the meeting at Copper Creek, and Jake Morrison stood on a hill overlooking the newly established settlement of Harmony Valley. Below him, Apache children played alongside the children of white settlers, their laughter carrying on the warm spring air. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago, yet here it was, living proof that the agreement hammered out in that abandoned trading post had taken root and grown into something remarkable. The settlement itself was unlike anything the Arizona Territory had ever seen. Houses built in both Apache and American styles dotted the valley floor, connected by well-worn paths that spoke of daily interaction between the two communities. Gardens flourished where Apache women had taught settler wives which dessert plants could be cultivated for food and medicine, while white farmers had shared techniques for irrigation and crop rotation that increased the yield of traditional Apache crops. Jake adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun and reflected on the long journey that had brought them all to this moment. The months following the Copper Creek Agreement had been fraught with challenges that had tested everyone's commitment to the fragile peace they had created. The first crisis had come just 3 weeks after the meeting, when a band of Mescalero Apache from New Mexico had raided a ranch 50 miles south of Fort Buchanan. Territorial officials had immediately blamed Standing Wolf's people, despite clear evidence that the raiders had come from outside the region. It was exactly the kind of incident that could have destroyed the entire agreement, but the early warning system they had established proved its worth. Standing Wolf scouts had tracked the Mescalero band to their hideout and provided the information that allowed Colonel Harrison's troops to apprehend them without involving any of the treaty Apache. The second major test had come from within the military itself. A group of officers led by Major William Carleton had complained to territorial headquarters that Harrison's soft policies were encouraging Apache aggression throughout the Southwest. They had demanded an investigation into the Copper Creek Agreement and Harrison's authority to negotiate with hostile Indians. Jake remembered the tense weeks when Harrison's career hung in the balance, waiting for officials in Washington to decide whether the experiment in peace would be allowed to continue. The breakthrough had come when the territorial governor received reports from other regions showing that Apache violence had actually decreased in areas where Standing Wolf's influence extended. The practical results spoke louder than political theory, and Harrison was not only vindicated but commended for his innovative approach to frontier security. But, perhaps the greatest challenge had been the work of building trust on a day-to-day level between people who had been taught to see each other as mortal enemies. This was where the real success of the agreement was measured, not in official reports or political speeches, but in the gradual accumulation of small moments when individuals chose cooperation over suspicion. Jake walked down the hill toward the settlement, noting the changes that 6 months of peace had brought.
The main street featured businesses operated by both Apache and white entrepreneurs. Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who had married into Standing Wolf's band, ran a trading post that had become the economic heart of the community. Her establishment facilitated not just commerce but cultural exchange, as people from both communities gathered to conduct business and share news. Next to the trading post stood the schoolhouse, perhaps the most revolutionary building in the entire territory. Here, Apache and white children learned together under the guidance of Sarah Mitchell, a teacher from back east who had volunteered for what many considered the most challenging educational assignment in America. The school taught English, arithmetic, and basic sciences, but it also included instruction in Apache history, traditional skills, and the oral traditions that were the foundation of Apache culture. Jake paused outside the schoolhouse window, listening to the sound of young voices reciting lessons in both English and Apache. Inside, he could see little Deer, now fluent in English but still proud of her Apache heritage, helping younger children with their reading. The sight brought back memories of that night at Willow Springs when she had first spoken of the markings that connected her to his brother Samuel. The markings were still there, of course, permanent reminders of the debt that had started this entire chain of events. But they had evolved from symbols of protection to badges of honor, worn by the three girls as signs of the bridge they had helped build between two worlds. Jake continued his walk through the settlement, stopping to talk with various residents who had become friends over the past months. Tom Bradley, a former cavalry sergeant who had been wounded in an Apache fight 3 years earlier, now worked alongside Red Hawk in a livestock operation that supplied horses to both the Army and Apache bands. Their partnership had begun as a matter of practical necessity but had grown into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared expertise. "Jake!" Tom called out as he approached. "Good timing. Red Hawk and I were just discussing the spring roundup. We could use your help coordinating with the ranchers to the south." Jake joined the two men at their makeshift outdoor office, really just a table under a ramada where they conducted their business. The sight of a former cavalry sergeant and an Apache warrior planning joint operations would have been inconceivable a year ago, but now it seemed as natural as the desert sunrise. "How many head are we talking about?" Jake asked, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a chair. "About 200 horses," Red Hawk replied in his careful but increasingly confident English. "Army wants 60 for replacement mounts, Apache bands need 40 for hunting season, and the rest go to civilian ranchers." The conversation that followed would have been routine in any frontier community, except for the fact that it represented something entirely new in the history of the American West: economic cooperation based on equality rather than domination. The Apache brought their unmatched knowledge of horse breeding and desert survival, while the white settlers contributed their understanding of larger market systems and transportation networks. As they talked, Jake noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the main trail. Colonel Harrison rode into the settlement with his usual small escort, but his visits had become so regular that they no longer caused excitement or concern. The relationship between the military and the Apache community had evolved from suspicious tolerance to active cooperation. Harrison dismounted and joined their discussion, bringing news from the outside world that affected their small community. "Washington has been asking questions about our operation here," he said without preamble. "Some officials are impressed by the results we're achieving. Others are concerned about the precedent we're setting." Jake felt a familiar chill of anxiety. The Harmony Valley experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, but its very success made it a target for those who preferred simpler, more violent solutions to frontier conflicts. "What kind of questions?" Red Hawk asked. "Whether this model could be applied to other regions, other tribes," Harrison replied. "And whether it represents effective military policy or dangerous weakness in the face of Indian resistance." Tom Bradley leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Seems to me the results speak for themselves. We haven't had a single violent incident in this region since the agreement was signed. Compare that to anywhere else in Apache country." Harrison nodded. "That's exactly the argument I've been making. But politics doesn't always respond to practical results. There are people in Washington who believe that any accommodation with Indian tribes is a betrayal of American interests." The discussion continued for an hour, covering the complex political challenges that threatened to undermine everything they had built. Jake found himself thinking about the delicate nature of peace, how much easier it was to destroy than to create. All their months of patient work could be undone by a single policy decision made by officials who had never set foot in the territory, never seen Apache children and white children playing together, never witnessed the daily miracles of cooperation that had become commonplace in Harmony Valley. As the afternoon wore on, other community leaders joined the discussion. Standing Wolf arrived with Singing Bird and 2 other Apache elders, while several white settlers stopped by to add their perspectives. What emerged was not just a conversation but a community meeting, the kind of democratic dialogue that had become the foundation of their shared governance. The settlement had developed its own informal system of leadership that drew from both Apache and American traditions. Major decisions were made by consensus after extensive discussion, with both traditional Apache councils and American town hall meetings contributing to the process. It wasn't always efficient, but it was inclusive and respected the values of both cultures. "We need to document what we've accomplished here," Sarah Mitchell suggested. She had joined the group after dismissing her students for the day, and her perspective as an educator brought a different dimension to their planning. "If Washington officials are asking questions, we should provide them with detailed reports about our successes." Standing Wolf nodded thoughtfully. White officials understand numbers, measurements of success that can be written on paper. Apache measures success in harmony, in children who grow strong, in elders who die peacefully. We must find ways to speak both languages. Over the next several hours, they developed a comprehensive plan to document and publicize the achievements of the Harmony Valley experiment. Sarah would write detailed educational reports showing how Apache and white children were excelling academically when given the opportunity to learn together. Tom and Red Hawk would compile economic data demonstrating the prosperity that resulted from cooperative resource management. Colonel Harrison would prepare military assessments showing how peace had improved security throughout the region. But, perhaps most importantly, they would invite officials to visit Harmony Valley and see the results for themselves. Nothing could substitute for witnessing the daily reality of successful cooperation between people who had been taught to hate each other. As the sun began to set over the desert mountains, the meeting gradually broke up as people returned to their evening routines. Jake found himself walking with Standing Wolf toward the Apache section of the settlement, where traditional wickiups stood alongside more conventional houses. "My friend," Standing Wolf said as they walked, "do you ever regret the choice you made that night at Willow Springs? The path you chose has brought great change to many lives." Jake considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had transformed him from a wandering cowboy into an accidental diplomat, a role he had never sought and wasn't always comfortable with. But, looking around at the thriving community they had helped create, he knew his answer. "The only thing I regret is that my brother Samuel isn't here to see what his promise has become," Jake said. He always believed that individual actions could change the world. "I used to think that was naive optimism. Now I think maybe he understood something the rest of us were too cynical to see." Standing Wolf smiled. "Your brother's spirit is here, in every child who grows up knowing peace instead of war, in every friendship that crosses the lines others have drawn. Death ends a life, but it cannot end a legacy." They had reached the edge of the Apache camp, where families were gathering around cooking fires for the evening meal. The sight brought back memories of that first desperate night when Jake had faced a circle of Apache warriors and made the choice that changed everything. Now those same warriors were neighbors and friends, their children playing with settler children as naturally as water flowing downhill. Little Deer emerged from one of the wickiups, carrying a baby who Jake realized was her newborn brother. The sight of the infant reminded him how much time had passed, how this new generation would grow up in a world very different from the one their parents had known. "Uncle Jake!" Little Deer called out, using the honorary title she had adopted for him. "Come meet my brother. Mother has named him Peace Walker, to honor the path our peoples now follow together." Jake approached the young woman who had played such a crucial role in bringing their communities together. She was taller now, more mature, but her eyes still held the same mixture of wisdom and hope that had struck him that first night. "He's beautiful," Jake said, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "And his name carries great responsibility.
All names do, Little Deer replied. But his generation will grow up knowing that Apache and white people can be family, not just enemies. That is a gift worth any responsibility. As Jake held the infant, he thought about the future this child would inherit. There would still be challenges, still be people on both sides who preferred the simplicity of hatred to the complexity of understanding. But this baby would grow up speaking both English and Apache, learning from both traditions, seeing cooperation as normal rather than revolutionary. The evening progressed with the easy rhythm that had become characteristic of Harmony Valley. Families from both communities gathered for shared meals, children played games that combined Apache and American traditions, and adults discussed the practical matters of daily life without regard to cultural boundaries. Jake found himself at the center of one such gathering, listening to Red Hawk tell stories of traditional Apache hunts while Tom Bradley shared tales of cavalry life before the peace. The juxtaposition would have been impossible a year ago, but now it was simply another evening among friends. As the night deepened and the desert stars emerged in their ancient patterns, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a man without purpose, drifting from job to job across the frontier. Samuel's promise had given him direction, but the Apache people had given him something more valuable, a community where he belonged, a cause worth fighting for, and the understanding that individual actions really could change the world. Colonel Harrison joined him as the evening wound down, the two men finding themselves alone under the vast canopy of stars. "Any word from Washington on the official response to our reports?" Jake asked. "Some," Harrison replied. "The territorial governor is cautiously supportive. He likes the practical results and the cost savings compared to military campaigns. But there are forces in Congress that see our success as a threat to their vision of westward expansion." Jake nodded. He had expected as much. Success was often more threatening to entrenched interests than failure, because it proved that alternative approaches were possible. "What happens if they order you to end the agreement?" Jake asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "Then, I suppose I'll have to decide whether I'm a soldier who follows orders or a man who does what's right. It's a choice I hope I never have to make." "And if you do have to make it?" Harrison looked out over the peaceful settlement, taking in the sight of two communities that had chosen cooperation over conflict. "Then, I'll remember what we've accomplished here, and I'll act accordingly." The next morning brought news that would test everyone's commitment to the peace they had built. A messenger arrived from Fort Buchanan with reports that Apache bands in other regions had conducted major raids against military installations and civilian settlements. The territorial government was under pressure to respond with overwhelming force, and some officials were arguing that all Apache, regardless of their peaceful intentions, should be considered hostile. The news hit Harmony Valley like a physical blow. Here was exactly the kind of external event that could destroy everything they had worked to create, not because of anything they had done wrong, but because the actions of others would be used to justify collective punishment. Jake gathered with the other community leaders to discuss their response. The mood was grim but determined. Everyone understood that they were fighting not just for their own community but for the principle that peace was possible between cultures that had been taught to see each other as enemies. "We must send delegations to every Apache band in the region," Standing Wolf said. "We must convince them that violence now will destroy the hope we have created for all our people. And I'll send reports to every military post and government official who will listen," Colonel Harrison added. "The territorial government needs to understand that there are Apache allies as well as Apache enemies." Sarah Mitchell spoke up from her position near the schoolhouse. "We should invite newspaper reporters to visit us, to see what we've accomplished and tell the world that there's another way forward." The discussion continued through the morning, with each member of the community contributing ideas about how to protect their experiment in peace. What emerged was a comprehensive campaign to demonstrate that their success was not an isolated anomaly but a model that could be replicated throughout the frontier. Over the following weeks, Harmony Valley became the center of intense activity as people worked to document and publicize their achievements. Reporters arrived from eastern newspapers, government officials came to conduct inspections, and delegations of both Apache and white leaders visited to learn from their experience. The most significant visit came from General George Crook,
the Army's leading expert on Indian warfare, who had been sent by Washington to assess the situation and make recommendations for future policy. Jake found himself giving the general a personal tour of the settlement, explaining how the various innovations in education, economics, and governance had evolved. "Mr. Morrison," General Crook said as they stood outside the schoolhouse, watching Apache and white children work together on a mathematics lesson, "what you've accomplished here challenges every assumption about frontier policy that I've held for 30 years. Maybe that means it's time for new assumptions, General," Jake replied. Crook nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is. The question is whether Washington is ready for such a fundamental change in approach." The answer to that question came 3 weeks later, in the form of an official delegation from the territorial government. The group included the territorial governor, 2 congressmen, and several military officials who had been skeptical of the Harmony Valley experiment. Jake and the other community leaders spent days preparing for this crucial visit, knowing that the future of their community and the broader question of frontier peace might depend on the impression they made. They organized demonstrations of their agricultural innovations, educational achievements, and economic cooperation. Most importantly, they made sure the visitors could see for themselves the daily reality of successful cooperation between Apache and white families. The climax of the visit came during a community meeting where both Apache and white residents spoke about their experiences. Little Deer, now 17 and serving as a cultural interpreter for visiting officials, addressed the gathering in both Apache and English. "Honored guests," she said, her young voice carrying the authority of lived experience, "you have come here to judge whether peace between our peoples is possible. But you are asking the wrong question. Peace is not just possible, it is necessary. The question you should ask is whether you have the courage to choose peace over the comfort of old hatreds." Her words were followed by testimony from Tom Bradley, who spoke about the economic benefits of cooperation, and from Sarah Mitchell, who presented evidence of educational success. Red Hawk described how the early warning system had prevented violence throughout the region, while Colonel Harrison provided detailed military assessments showing improved security. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Standing Wolf addressed the delegation directly, speaking of the deeper spiritual dimensions of the peace they had created. "In Apache tradition," he said, "we believe that all living things are connected, that harm to one affects all others. For too long, our peoples have been trapped in a circle of harm that has wounded both Apache and white communities. Here in Harmony Valley, we have proven that this circle can be broken, that a new pattern of relationship is possible." When the presentation concluded, the delegates spent several hours in private discussion before announcing their preliminary conclusions. The territorial governor, a pragmatic man named Samuel Crawford, spoke for the group. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we have witnessed here is remarkable by any standard. The practical achievements, reduced violence, economic prosperity, successful education, speak for themselves. But, beyond the practical benefits, you have demonstrated something more important, that Americans of different backgrounds can work together to solve problems rather than simply fighting over them." He paused, looking around the assembled community. "The territorial government is prepared to officially endorse the Harmony Valley model as a template for future frontier policy. We will recommend to Washington that similar agreements be negotiated with other Apache bands throughout the Southwest." The announcement was met with cautious celebration. Everyone understood that official endorsement was just the beginning of a much larger process, but it represented validation of everything they had worked to achieve. As the delegation prepared to depart, General Crook approached Jake for a private conversation. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I want you to know that your work here will be studied and discussed in military academies for years to come. You've proven that there are alternatives to the cycle of violence that has characterized frontier expansion." Jake was touched by the recognition, but his thoughts were focused on the future rather than the past. "General, the real test will be whether we can spread this model to other regions, other conflicts. Harmony Valley is just the beginning of what's possible." Crook nodded. "That's why I'm recommending that the Army establish a new position, Special Advisor on Frontier Relations. The job would involve traveling to other regions where conflicts exist and attempting to replicate what you've accomplished here. Would you be interested in such a position?" The offer was both exciting and daunting. It would mean leaving the community he had helped build, but it also offered the possibility of spreading the principles they had proven throughout the American West. "I'll need to discuss it with the community here," Jake said.
"This isn't just my success, it belongs to everyone who chose cooperation over conflict."
That evening, Jake called a community meeting to discuss General Crook's offer. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, even though it meant losing one of their founding members. "You must go," Standing Wolf said. "The spirits brought you to us when we needed a bridge between worlds. Now they call you to build other bridges in other places." Little Deer, now a respected voice in community decisions despite her youth, agreed. "Uncle Jake, your brother's promise has been fulfilled here. But there are other places where children live in fear, where families are torn apart by hatred. They need what you have learned here." The discussion continued late into the night, with community members sharing their thoughts about the opportunity and the challenges it would bring. In the end, the consensus was clear: Jake should accept the position and take the lessons of Harmony Valley to other corners of the frontier. As he prepared to leave Harmony Valley several weeks later, Jake reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in his life over the past year. He had begun as a man without purpose, driven only by family obligation to honor his brother's promise. Now he was embarking on a mission that could reshape frontier relations throughout the American West. The send-off was both celebration and ceremony, combining Apache and American traditions in a way that had become characteristic of the community. Standing Wolf presented Jake with a traditional Apache war shirt decorated with symbols representing his status as a bridge between worlds. Sarah Mitchell gave him a leather-bound journal to record his experiences and observations. Colonel Harrison provided official military credentials that would give him authority to negotiate with both military and civilian officials. But perhaps the most meaningful gift came from Little Deer, who approached him as the ceremony concluded. She carried a small leather pouch containing earth from the spot where they had first met at Willow Springs. "Carry this with you," she said, "to remember that peace is always possible when people choose to see each other as human beings first." As Jake mounted his horse for the journey that would take him to new challenges in Colorado, New Mexico, and beyond, he looked back at the thriving community of Harmony Valley. Apache and white families stood together, waving goodbye to the man who had helped make their peaceful coexistence possible. The desert sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It seemed fitting that he should begin this new chapter of his life at sunrise, with the promise of new horizons stretching endlessly ahead. Jake Morrison had found his purpose at last, not as a cowboy or a gunfighter or any of the other roles he had tried on during his wandering years, but as a builder of bridges between divided peoples. It was a calling that his brother Samuel would have understood and approved, a legacy worthy of the promise that had started it all. As he rode toward the rising sun, Jake carried with him the lessons of Harmony Valley and the hope that what they had accomplished in one small corner of the Arizona territory could be replicated wherever people had the courage to choose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict, and peace over the easy comfort of old hatreds. The story that had begun with a desperate cowboy surrounded by Apache warriors had become something far greater, a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of individual courage, and the enduring truth that all people, regardless of their background or beliefs, share the same fundamental hopes for safety, prosperity, and dignity for their children. In the end, that was Samuel Morrison's true legacy, not the promise he had made to protect Apache children, but the understanding that such protection was necessary precisely because all children, Apache and white alike, deserved to inherit a world better than the one their parents had known. Jake Morrison carried that legacy forward into an uncertain future, armed with nothing more than hard-won wisdom and the unshakable conviction that peace was always possible for those brave enough to pursue it.